All right. Good evening, everybody. I'm Reverend Richard Nordgren, Associate Member of St. John's Lutheran Church in beautiful downtown Greenpoint, Brooklyn. And this is a continuation of a series of Bible studies known as the Many Faces of God. Over the last weeks, we have been reading in the Old Testament the various ways that God has been represented, and even the way that God represents himself. Tonight we'll be studying one of my favorite and perhaps one of the more controversial books of the Old Testament, the book of Job. Job is one of those books which falls into the category known as wisdom literature. Last week we looked at Proverbs as perhaps the classical example of wisdom literature. But if Proverbs and its other companion pieces like Lamentations that we'll get to in the future are guides for contented living, then Job falls into a very different type of wisdom literature. In fact, the bulk of Job, can be read as the work or the prep work of the defense team in a trial, trying to get the accused to accept a good plea deal. So the book of Job is divided into three thematic portions. The first and the last are relatively short. In fact, the first part is only 3 chapters long. And then the second longer division goes from 4 to 37. And the third part wraps it up from 38 through 42. Okay? A little bit about Job. We know from the text that he is a Gentile, but he is a righteous man. God has said he can find no fault or blame to place it on the ledger of Job. He has been honorable and honest in his dealings with people. He has not sinned. And if there's sins that are unknown to him, he has asked for them to be forgiven. He is a prosperous farm person. He has a loving wife and many children. And in the closing years of his life, Job has all the reasons in the world to believe he has done well. Well, his condition in life would soon change. From that brief introduction to Job, the scene shifts, to the heavenly courts. What we find in the text is a very strange and unsettling relationship between God and Satan. Now, normally we think of Satan as the personification of evil. But in the book of Job, the Satan is sort of like God's golf buddy. They're not necessarily welded at the hip, but they have a long and familiar and perhaps even, shall I say, intimate relationship. And in this account, Satan has been doing some traveling. And so they've come back together after a while and sort of catching up, finding out what's been going on. And God asked Satan if he had seen this fellow Job, his man Job, on his travels. And Job said no. And God goes then to lay all sorts of praise and acclamation on Job. How good he is, how faithful he is, how just he is, how considerate he is. And Satan says, yeah, the only reason he's doing all those good things is because you reward him richly. Take the rewards away, and he's just going to be like any other schlep, And God said, no, I'm not so sure about that. Okay. But it's sort of strange in another way that, first of all, it's strange that God and Satan should have that type of conversation. It's not an adversarial conversation as such, but there's some challenge and competition built into the relationship. But it does note that Job was not an Israelite; he is a Moabite. And Moabites are usually not considered to be part of God's benevolent plan. The nation had a long and bitter history of conflict and antagonism with Israel. And in fact, Israel was prohibited from having friendly relationships with the Moabites. And here is Satan assuring God that Job is a good person, a righteous man, even though he's not an Israelite. And God defends, Job, saying, he's true blue, he's solid, he's rock solid. And Satan goes back to his point is, if he hadn't been richly rewarded, he would be just like any other schlep, easily tempted. Well, God wasn't going to let that challenge go unanswered. And so he makes a bet, a wager, with Satan. He says, do whatever you can, do whatever you want, except you can't kill Job, make his life as miserable as you can make it. And my bet is that he's going to remain rock solid. Satan said, nah, I'll take that bet, because I know, Job he'll be crushed. His spirit, his faith, his belief, all be crushed. And he's going to curse you and hope he dies. So with that, the two shake hands on the bet, and Satan goes off and does a marvelous job of wrecking Job's life. Just a thorough wipeout of everything. And to get a sense of what that is like, I'd like someone to read, a passage from the book. It's in the first chapter, verses 1 through 12, and then two isolated verses, 22 and 29.
Chapter 1, say it again, please.
1, verses 1 through 12, and then 22 and 29.
22 and 29. There was once a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. That man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. There were born to him 7 sons and 3 daughters. He had 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 donkeys, and very many servants, so that this man was the greatest of all the people of the East. His sons used to go and hold feast in one another's houses in turn, and they would send and invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. And when the feast days had run their course, Job would send and sanctify them, and he would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, "It may be that my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." This is what Job always did. One day, the heavenly beings came to present themselves before the Lord, and Hasatan also came among them. The Lord said to Hasatan, "Where have you come from?" Hasatan answered the Lord, "From going to and fro on the earth and from walking up and down on it." The Lord said to him, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil." Then Hasatan answered the Lord, "Does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not put a fence around him and his house and all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand now and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face." And then which two, Richard?
22 and 29.
22 and 29. And all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrongdoing. And 29?
No, chapter 2, verse 9. 2:9.
Then Job's wife said to him, "Do you still persist in your integrity? Curse God and die." She's the most sensible wife ever.
Truly, yeah, truly is. In the second chapter, verses 1 through 9, it either you have a repeat of the first story, or God gave Satan another dispensation to wreck Job's life in additional ways. But in either case, there has been a really good job of messing him up. He's lost kids, he's lost his sources of income, he's lost his wealth, he's lost his health, and he's been challenged, to say, the hell with you, God, do what you're going to do with me. Just, I don't care anymore. I'll curse you and then I'll die. But as God predicted, and Satan, failed to deliver, Job remained faithful. He held on to his integrity, and he did not curse God. The word of his sad afflictions, spread to his friends and to his neighbors, and a cadre of them came over to console him and give him comfort. What we see in chapters 4 through 37 is probably some of the worst examples of pastoral care that you can imagine. Because the fellows who came to sit with Job and to try and lift his spirits were true believers in this, what we call the Deuteronomic model of the relationship between Israel and God. And in that model, God has agreed way back to the time of Abraham to look out after, to protect, to provide for his people. But at Sinai, the covenant was modified, so that the blessings that God could give his people, were conditioned on their behavior. Primarily that if they stayed away from idolatry, if they did not seek other gods, then they would be blessed. Some of the prophets would emphasize the importance of justice and right dealings with other people. But whichever it was, whichever they wanted to place the emphasis, it was all set up on this equation of quid pro quo. You do what you're supposed to do. You honor me only, said God, and you obey the rules that I have set up for your interactions with one another, and I will make sure that you're taken care of. As Satan had said, you put a fence, around Job and all that he had. Nobody could get to him. So the friends of Job, had absorbed, and integrated this theological point of view into their very being. They knew nothing else. The other explanations or models, just didn't come into their radar screen. So they spent a long, long time trying to convince Job that he must have committed some sin, or otherwise, why would God inflict all this punishment on him? Why would God make his life so miserable if he had not somehow transgressed, known or unknown? To get a sense of how the comforters were trying to comfort Job, I'm going to ask for a reader from the 8th chapter to go to the 8th chapter and read verses 1 through 7. Tess, could that be you?
Sure. Hold on. Let me
Okay.
just enter that in. 8th chapter, 1 through 7.
Yes.
Okay. Then Bildad the Shuhite answered, "How long will you say these things, and the words of your mouth be a great wind? Does God pervert justice, or does the Almighty pervert the right? If your children sinned against him, he delivered them into the power of their transgression. if you will seek God and make supplication to the Almighty, if you are pure and upright, surely then he will rouse himself for you and restore you to your rightful place. Though your beginning was small, your latter days will be very great.
Okay. Um, Well, he had other friends who tried to convince him using somewhat different argument. So, Megan, would you read chapter 11, 1 through 6?
Okay. Then Zophar the Mammothite answered, should a multitude of words go unanswered, and should one full of talk be vindicated? Should your babble put others to silence, and when you mock, shall no one shame you? For you say, my conduct is pure, and I am clean in God's sight. But oh, that God would speak and open his lips to you, and that he would tell you the secrets of wisdom, for wisdom is many-sided. Now, know then that God exacts of you less than your guilt deserves.
Okay, thank you. And, one more example, since he had a multitude of comforters who all tried different approaches. In chapter 13, verses 20 through 28. Pastor, would you take that one?
13:20 to 28.
Yeah.
Only grant two things to me, that I will not hide myself from your face, withdraw your hand far from me, and do not let dread of you terrify me. Then call and I will answer, or let me speak and you reply to me. How many are my iniquities and my sins? Make known my transgressions and my sin. Why do you hide your face and count me as your enemy? Will you frighten a wind-blown leaf and pursue dry chaff? For you write bitter things against me and make me reap the iniquities of my youth. You put my feet in the stocks and watch all my paths. You set a bound to the soles of my feet. One wastes away like a rotten thing, like a garment that is moth-eaten.
Okay. Yeah. Well, this goes on chapter after chapter after chapter, with some variations. But the central point that the comforters are trying to make Job see is that somehow, some way, known or unknown, he has sinned, and this is his punishment. If he would repent of that sin, then his punishment and suffering would cease. The trouble was that Job knew he was innocent. He had gotten the certificate, from the heavenly being. The bureaucracy in the heavens had let it be known to him that he had passed muster, and he could not be shaken from that conviction. He wasn't going to turn his integrity into trash, because he knew, if he did, his statement of innocence would be worthless. It would be meaningless. Okay? So the comforters tried and they failed, and so God fired them. And in their place, God took over the leadership of the negotiating team. I'll read from chapter 38 to give you a sense of God's approach to dealing with this situation. So now it's God who's talking directly to Job. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Gird up your loins like a man. I'll question you, and you shall declare to me. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me, where is your understanding? Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Who stretched out the line upon it? On what was its base sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone? And the morning stars sang together, and all the heavenly beings shouted for joy. Or who shut in the sea with the doors when it burst out from the womb, when I made its clouds garments and thick darkness its swaddling band? And described bounds for it, and set bars and doors, and said, thus thou shalt not come no further, and here shall your proud waves be stopped. And for the rest of chapter 38 and into 39, we find God declining to use reason, trying to actually be comforting, but it uses bluff and force and naked power to bully Job into confessing. God didn't use reason or persuasive arguments or elegant rhetoric for Job to get in a new set of mind. He just used raw, naked power. And indeed, 38 and 39, they're just an awesome catalog of what the power of God had accomplished. In the few verses that I read, it talks about how God might had created everything that is. And sarcastically, God says, like, son, where were you when all this was going on? Who were you directing? Whose measurements were you taking? And how did you direct their use? Job never questioned God's ability to do things. God's power was never part of the question that he had asked. So all Job could do at this point, after this display, this this huge, massive onslaught of evidence of God's power, all Job could do was silently assent to the obvious. God was Almighty. There's no arguing that point. That would be a fool's errand. So Job's question, though, about justice, which was not about the power of God, did not get addressed at all. God was silent on that point. I like to say that there's lots of times people give me very good answers to questions I've not asked. So I asked them to think about it again. But God was acting from behind a shield wall of power, and not taking up the question of fairness and rightness. And I think it's pretty obvious to see that in the approach that God took. He knew there was a problem, and he wanted to avoid dealing with the question that Job asked, so he ignored it. But at this point, it's becoming very clear from the text that both God and Job, not just Job, but God and Job, knew that God had allowed an innocent man to be tortured on a whim. And the man is asking why. And whatever answer God could have come up with would have put him in a very bad light. The optics would have been horrible. It was a very different setup from when the prophets warned Israel that their idolatry, their misbehavior, their sin, had come to God's attention, and there was going to be consequences unless they repented. And that was fine when Israel was truly guilty of the sins as charged. But repeatedly, we've seen in the text that God himself, considered Job to be a righteous and blameless man, who did not deserve to have his life messed up, and he personally tortured him. In this story, compared to the stories we've read about the prophets, in this story, we're dealing with one individual's relationship with God, how that person stands in the presence and light of God. which is a very different situation from when the prophets were active and prevalent. Because they were dealing there with a nation. Don't know exactly how many people it was, but obviously it was in thousands or tens of thousands. And when you have large numbers like that, small differences, can be unseen. But when you're dealing with less abstract, numbers of people, the difference at the personal level is more and more apparent. There's a sense of identity with other persons, who may be absent from the nation which they're a part of, but it is at the personal level, the dynamics shift and change in comparison to dealing with the nation as a whole. Okay? So as I said, God went on for several chapters, ranting and raving, on how powerful and how almighty he was. Job,
Pastor Nordgren.
speaking.
I often say that our comedians are our prophets today. And you talking about the difference, the painful difference between like dealing with a nation and just thousands of humans as opposed to one person that you're watching like this. Eddie Izzard does this whole thing. He's a British comedian. I think it's Eddie Izzard. And he talks about like, if you kill one person, that's a tragedy. If you kill 10 or 15, like that makes you a serial killer. And we kind of admire you a little bit and we'll study you. But if you're like Pol Pot and you just kill hundreds of thousands and millions of people, Stalin-like in your approach, then we just kind of go, oh, well done. That's pretty amazing, and you become a history lesson. So I think that part of the abrupt rudeness of this book is that, it's a person.
Yeah.
And we're forced to kind of look at what is happening to a person.
Okay.
So I think it's really
identify with. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. Going back to your comment about the comedians. I believe it was Joseph Stalin who said, quantity has a quality all of its own. And he is responsible for a lot of quantity. Yeah. So God's display of power had failed in its main mission, which was to get the damn troublesome question off the table. God had tried to turn the table and put Job on trial, but Job was determined. He was silent most of the time, but he would continue to ask the question, until he got an answer. But God, didn't have too many, cards in his hand that he could play very effectively. So he once again, tried the tactics of bluff and bullying. When the first time, Job silently listened and nodded in agreement. Yeah, you're almighty. You've done amazing things. Okay. But after the second, eruption on the part of God, in chapter 42 are, I think, the critical verses, in this whole book. And on it, lies some good or some bad interpretations. In 42, it begins. Then Job answered the Lord. First time I said he remained silent. So the first thing he says is in verse 42a, 2a. I know you can do all things. It's and in 42:3, he even quotes scripture to agree to that contention. Actually quoting God himself. Who is this that hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore, and in 42:3b, we have sort of a counterboast. I have uttered what I did not understand, things that were too wonderful for me, which I did not know. Now, I think a lot of commentators and preachers will take 42:3 and say, oh, Job, is really humble. He is. He's now softening. His intransience is fading away. I don't think so. I think this is a counterboast. You're so smart. Well, I'm so dumb. If I can't be famous and well known and for something good, I'll take it for being bad. Glory is glory. Self-esteem is self-esteem. And Job goes on in verse 4, acknowledging that everything that God has said to him, is true. He has personal experience, to back it up. And then Job says, "I know what you can do to me. You can wipe me out in the blink of your eye." But he does not retract his question. He leaves it out there. It's hanging. It's hanging there. And as I would imagine it, God and Job are eyeball to eyeball, and God blinks. God blinks. He could have obliterated Job. Probably he could have perhaps come up with a different approach, but he didn't. He blinked. The wager was dropped. God compensated Job twofold. And this is extremely important. After God blinked, we have a sense that justice and power had been reunited in God. Putting this another way, Job did not allow God to become a moral monster. God had almighty power, and he misused it. That part of his nature, that esteems justice and rightness, and fair dealing, had dropped out of the picture in this moment of testosterone-driven, wager with the Satan. But Job had the character, the integrity, and the willingness to take the risk of not retracting his question, but instead, making God blink and thinking that in the future, justice and power, must be united, because otherwise, absolute power, as Lord Acton said, corrupts absolutely. Another strange thing we don't see in the text, but we will see in subsequent weeks. After this conversation, God is silent. We find God's name mentioned, in the books ahead. Not always, he never shows up in Esther. Doesn't show up in the Song of Songs. But what is noteworthy is that God has no more to say to his people after this exchange with Job. The book of Job, while dealing with the fate and concerns of one person, represents one step in the evolution of theological discourse, in the period after the exile. Before that catastrophe, the nation as a unity had been the focal point of the relationship between it and God. The Psalms, were about the concerns and conditions of ordinary people. But by and large, the Old Testament, certainly after the Sinai covenant, was about the relationship between God and a group of people, not about God and individuals. But particularly with Job, we can see that in society, that there are good people and that there are bad people. Within the nation that God had picked, there were good people and there were bad people. This is sort of a new idea in Old Testament theology. Hitherto had been the nation as a whole that had either been good or bad. But now we see, that there's a recognition that within the nation, there are some people who are good most of the time. There are some people who are bad most of the time. Some people who are, both good and bad, at the same time. And as in the case of Job, some people who are blameless at a particular moment in time. Now, if you accept as a possibility that within the nation there are righteous people who are like Job, and knowing that if the punishment that God has specified would be inflicted on the nation, if that was going to happen, there was bound to be collateral damage. It's just inevitable. And if God is just, how do you set about wiping out or punishing those who deserve it, while sparing those who are innocent? It raises the question: is it morally responsible to permit making victims out of good people so that the bad ones could be punished? I'll tell you, it's complicated. Then you have to ask the question, well, is God protected by sovereign immunity? That in itself is an interesting question. So I want to toss those out, to you for your reflection and comments, to see if what you think about my interpretation that of verses in 42 that God knew that he had not defeated Job and that it was his turn to back off and to make amends. Your thoughts, your thoughts.
Go ahead, Megan.
What was like the exact question?
Well, okay,
Hold on.
there's a bunch of them. But is it morally justifiable to make victims of good people so that the bad people are punished?
I don't think so, but I mean,
Mm-hmm.
But that's just not really often what happens. So, just another way that this is very different from like what actual society does. So,
Okay.
so yeah, there's my thought on that.
Okay, how about you, Tess?
Yeah, it's interesting. It is complex. It's almost like I don't know if I'm going to explain this the right way. It's almost like the question is like, or the way I'm perceiving the question is in order to punish the bad ones, first we must identify the good ones as victims, right? But then sometimes it's like, there are times where I see it the other way around.
Mm-hmm.
It's like we don't really initially make the good ones victims, but then we sort of push that argument. I don't know. it's weird. It's almost like the chicken or the egg for me. You know what I
Okay.
mean?
Yeah, yeah. There's a the famous observation from the Vietnam War. You know, we had to destroy the village in order to save it. You know?
Mhm.
Pastor, how about
Well,
you? What do
Well, I
you
mean,
think?
we have a term for that, right? Collateral damage. The people we
Right.
didn't mean to kill when in pursuit of the people that we did mean to kill.
Yeah,
We're sorry about that, but that's what happens. It's war. Um, I the first time I really intensely studied Job was this was the first class I took from my doctoral level degree with this amazing pastor and theologian over in Philadelphia. But I'd been floundering for about a year because I had been caught in a shootout, and a member of my church had been shot and killed 10 times. No, shot 10 times and killed that same night. He didn't die 10 times. And the shootout I was caught in was two guys shooting at each other right as school had let out. And so there were people like Nina's age and younger on the street, and they were shooting at each other. And it was a very bad day. And I went to this book, and when I learned that he has everything, it's taken away, and then it's all restored because he's faithful. When I learned that that was a bookend, these were bookends that were added after the fact. It actually helped me a lot because the tension of evil being unanswered, except that he was faithful and he got it all back because he remained faithful. It's just not true. We see people who are blameless and faithful get screwed over all the time,
right. Yeah.
And so to have this bookend of, oh, it's okay in the end is horrible, I think. But the book itself does not answer the question of theodicy,
Right.
the question of evil. And what I have kind of come to is that because Job remained in it, he just stayed in it. He refused to leave the relationship to curse God and die. God did come and do this to him. As you said, God, did the biggest bully pulpit imaginable, but he got to see God,
Mm-hmm.
And that's grace of a kind. It's a horrible grace. But, I think grace is horrible in so many ways. Revenge is so much more satisfying and easy and natural. You punch me, I'm going to punch you back.
Right.
It's so much more natural. Grace is awful. It requires things of me that I don't want to give. It requires me to be a person I don't want to become. And I think that, as I've lived with, these horrible things that I've had to deal with as a pastor, murders and death and a baby being murdered and all of these things that I've dealt with over the years. And I go back to Job and I'm like, grace sucks. It sucks, And it's like, oh, we're saved by grace. That's great. Do you know what that cost you? Do you know what that requires of you? It requires everything of you. So, I think God put God's self into a corner. I think God hanging out with, bad characters like Hasatan, it's like, make better decisions, please, Jesus, So, yeah, but I think this is one of the most important and misunderstood books. And I don't think we have a clue what it really means. I think we get small glimpses of it, but I think it's a book that we go back to and go, God, I didn't see that. I didn't understand that. Oh, this life experience gives me a different lens. I think it's just an amazing book.
Mm-hmm. Well, what is implied in the conclusion of the book is that God recognized that he had done wrong to Job. And, he makes amends by,
Here,
he
cash
doesn't
and
act,
prizes.
Yeah. So that raises the question, is God governed by sovereign immunity? In other words, would it have been theologically and spiritually appropriate to hold God accountable for this?
Well, process theology, which I'm not a fan of. You may be a fan of it, Pastor Nordgren, but it's like God is, becoming. But I think that God, with destroying Sodom and Gomorrah, like with destroying things or raining down hellfire, that God's mind can be changed. Like part of the purpose of prayer is we petition God. We call to God. God says, I heard the cries of my people. I'm going to liberate them. It only took 400 years, but finally got around to it. I don't think we do God or people any favors when we blame all that is unpleasant and evil on Satan.
Right.
Satan, Hasatan, the Satan, was a part of God's court. He was hanging out in heaven, right? We don't, evil most often is done by us without any inspiration from the devil. I think evil is real. I happen to think that there are demons and all kinds of things. I really do believe that. But I think that we see them and blame them far more often than they deserve credit for. We do it by ourselves.
That's right.
All the time.
It's a nice way of shirking responsibility.
Yeah. So, but I think one of the things that this does, though, even leaving it unanswered, is that we can rage at God.
Yeah.
Job did. And there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah. He wasn't punished for that.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And so
He was punished because God's ego got in the way.
that's right. Okay.
That is a heresy I will own, that I will say and I will own. God's ego caused a problem.
It would. Yeah. I mean, if you stick to the text, you're going into that conclusion. There's no way of avoiding it. Apologists can try as they will to skirt the problem, but Job's question is still going to be on the table. Okay. Well, I think we'll wrap it up for tonight, folks. Thanks for being part of this class. And I think we have services on Sunday morning at 10 o'clock. We have co-conspirators, another worship service on Tuesday evening at 8 o'clock. Welcome you to all of those services. And we have evening and morning prayers on a daily basis. So St. John's is continuing to provide spiritual nurture and worship of God and opportunities for service to Christ through this pandemic. So join me in prayer. Loving and gracious God, you have recognized the limits of power and the power of justice. You have understood the limits of what might can do and open up the possibility of what fairness can accomplish. You have shown us, that whenever we pursue, our own ends, when we think only of ourselves and we use our abilities, to make good things happen for us, we become stunted and blind, and we fail to recognize that your circle of concern, embraces all of creation. So we thank you for the words and examples that we find in Scripture that lead us to the conclusion that in our dealings with one another, we need to be fair and helpful need to be, useful, use our power in that way, and loving and compassionate at the same time. We know that that is a hard calculus to solve, and so we pray for your Holy Spirit to give us insight and the ability to find that path where love and justice kiss each other, where peace and righteousness embrace. We ask your blessings on those who are in special need of it this evening. And we hope that you will keep us safe until we join together in your Son's name. Amen.